Number 1. Dennis Rader. Dennis Lynn Rader had successfully evaded capture for 30 years. Between 1974 and 1991, he murdered 10 people in Wichita, Kansas, binding, torturing, and killing his victims in their own homes. He called himself BTK, sent taunting letters to police and media, and then, in 1991, he simply stopped. For 13 years, the case went cold. Investigators believed he was dead, imprisoned for another crime, or had somehow satisfied his compulsions. They were wrong. Rader was living in plain sight as a compliance officer in Park City, a church council president, a married father of 2. He had never stopped thinking about his crimes. He just stopped killing. In January 2004, the Wichita Eagle published an article marking the 30th anniversary of Rader's first murders, headlined, "BTK, Case Unsolved, 30 Years Later." When Rader read it, he later told investigators he was kind of bored. The article reignited something in him, not the urge to kill, but the need for recognition. In March 2004, he mailed a letter to the newspaper signed by a pseudonym, claiming responsibility for the 1986 murder of Vicki Wegerle. Inside the envelope were photographs of her body and a photocopy of her driver's license, which had been stolen at the time of her death. Police confirmed the letter was authentic. BTK was back. Over the next several months, Rader sent a steady stream of communications. He mailed packages containing word puzzles, dolls bound to resemble his victims, and chapters of a fictionalized autobiography. He left materials in public locations, sometimes inside cereal boxes. Surveillance footage from a Home Depot parking lot in January 2005 showed a person in a black Jeep Cherokee dropping off one such package. Investigators were gathering pieces, but they still did not know who he was. Rader, confident in his ability to stay hidden, wanted to keep the communication going. In one of his letters, he asked police a direct question. Could they trace a floppy disk back to him if he sent one? It was a critical miscalculation. The question revealed both his ignorance of digital forensics and his growing arrogance. Rader believed he could control the exchange. Police saw an opportunity. In early February 2005, they placed a classified advertisement in the Wichita Eagle that read, "Rex, it will be okay." The ad was placed by Detective Cheryl James using the fake name Cindy Johnson. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, who led the BTK task force, later called it his favorite lie of all time. Rader saw the ad and accepted it as truth. He trusted the police. On February 16, 2005, a purple 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk arrived at KSAS television in Wichita. It was marked Test Floppy for WPD review. Also enclosed were a letter, a gold necklace, and a photocopy of the cover of a crime novel about a serial killer. The disc was handed to Officer Randy Stone, a computer forensics expert with the Wichita Police Department. Stone used forensic software to recover deleted files and examine hidden metadata. What he found was immediate and decisive. A deleted Microsoft Word document on the disk had been used to create a church meeting agenda. The metadata revealed 2 critical pieces of information. The document had last been modified by a user named Dennis, and it had been created on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. Investigators conducted an internet search and found the church's website. Listed as president of the congregation was Dennis Rader. Detectives drove past Rader's home in Park City and observed a black Jeep Cherokee parked in the driveway. It matched the vehicle seen in surveillance footage from earlier package drop-offs. Within 9 days of receiving the floppy disk, police had identified their suspect. To confirm their case, investigators needed DNA evidence. They obtained a warrant to access a pap smear from Rader's 26-year-old daughter, Carrie Rawson, which had been stored at the Kansas State University Medical Clinic. A DNA test conducted at a lab in Topeka showed a familial match to a sample that had been recovered from under the fingernails of Vicki Wegerle, the victim Rader had claimed in his March 2004 letter. The chain of evidence was complete. On February 25, 2005, shortly after noon, police pulled over Dennis Rader while he was driving near his home during a lunch break from his job as a compliance officer. An officer asked him if he knew why he was being taken downtown. Rader responded calmly, "Oh, I have suspicions why." The next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams announced to the press, "The bottom line, BTK is arrested." During his interrogation, which lasted more than 30 hours, Rader confessed to all 10 murders in meticulous detail. He showed no remorse, only pride in the planning and execution of his crimes. But he was visibly shaken by one realization. He repeatedly asked Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, "I need to ask you, how come you lied to me? How come you lied to me?" Landwehr replied, "Because I was trying to catch you." Rader later admitted, "The floppy did me in." He had believed the police wanted him to finish telling his story. He thought he had established a rapport with them. His need for attention, his belief that he could trust investigators, and his fundamental misunderstanding of technology had converged into a single, irreversible mistake. In June 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms, a minimum of 175 years without the possibility of parole. Kansas had not enforced the death penalty at the time the murders were committed, so it was the harshest sentence available. Rader is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he is held in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. He is now 80 years old. His earliest possible release date is the year 2180. The case that had remained unsolved for 3 decades was closed not by a dramatic breakthrough, but by a killer's ego, a simple lie, and a piece of outdated technology he did not understand. Number 2. Israel Keyes. On February 1, 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the closing shift at the Common Grounds coffee stand on Tudor Road in Anchorage, Alaska. Just before closing time, a man wearing a ski mask approached the stand and ordered a coffee. When Koenig handed it to him, he pulled a gun and demanded money. He climbed into the stand, bound her with zip ties, and forced her toward a pickup truck parked across the street. The vehicle's license plates had been removed and the toolboxes taken off the bed. Koenig tried to run, but the man tackled her to the ground, put one arm around her, and pressed the gun to her body. He told her the weapon had very quiet ammunition and that she should not do anything to make him kill her. He drove her to his home and locked her in a shed on the property. The man was Israel Keyes, a 34-year-old construction worker who had been living in Anchorage with his girlfriend and young daughter. For more than a decade, Keyes had been one of the most methodical serial killers in American history. Born January 7, 1978 in Utah, Keyes was raised in extreme isolation in rural Washington state, where his family lived in a cabin without electricity or running water and attended white supremacist churches. After serving in the United States Army from 1998 to 2001, he moved to Neah Bay, Washington, then later to Alaska, where he established Keyes Construction and appeared to be an ordinary member of the community. But Keyes had spent years perfecting a system designed to make his crimes nearly impossible to solve. He traveled thousands of miles to select victims at random, avoiding any pattern that could connect the murders. He buried what he called kill kits in remote locations across the country. 5-gallon buckets containing weapons, ammunition, zip ties, cash, and tools, then returned years later to use them. He financed his activities by robbing banks and burglarizing homes, always paying in cash and turning off his cell phone to avoid detection. He studied serial killers and FBI profiling techniques, learning what mistakes led to their capture and ensuring he never repeated them. He chose victims based purely on opportunity, not demographics, and disposed of their bodies far from where he killed them. In June of 2011, he flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and drove to Essex, Vermont, where he murdered Bill and Lorraine Currier, a couple he selected simply because their house had an attached garage that was easy to enter. He had buried a kill kit near their home 2 years earlier. The Curriers' bodies were never found. Investigators believe Keyes killed at least 11 people between 2001 and 2012, though he confessed to only 3 before his death. The night Keyes kidnapped Samantha Koenig, he forced her to reveal where her boyfriend kept the shared ATM card and the PIN number. He drove to her boyfriend's home and retrieved the card from a truck parked outside. When the boyfriend confronted him, Keyes fled. He returned to the shed, assaulted Koenig, and strangled her to death. Hours later, he woke his daughter and flew with her to New Orleans, where his girlfriend joined them for a 2-week Caribbean cruise that had been booked months in advance. Koenig's body remained in the shed the entire time. When Keyes returned to Anchorage on February 18th, he sexually assaulted Koenig's corpse, then applied makeup to her face and sewed her eyelids open with fishing line. He posed her body next to a 4-day-old copy of the Anchorage Daily News dated February 13th and took a photograph to make it appear she was still alive. He photocopied the image, typed a ransom note on the back demanding $30,000, and placed it in a local park. Using Koenig's cell phone, he texted her boyfriend with instructions on where to find the note. He then dismembered her body, drove to Matanuska Lake, cut a hole in the ice, and disposed of the remains. Koenig's father, with help from the community, deposited ransom money into the account connected to his daughter's ATM card. Police were monitoring the account, hoping to track whoever made a withdrawal. This was the moment Israel Keyes made the mistake that would end his decade-long killing spree. On March 1st, he used Koenig's debit card to withdraw cash in Anchorage. He wore a disguise, but the ATM cameras captured his image. Over the next 9 days, Keyes continued using the card as he traveled through the southwestern United States. On March 7th, he withdrew $400 in Wilcox, Arizona. On March 8th, he took out $80 in Lordsburg, New Mexico, then $480 at the People's State Bank in Shepherd, Texas. On March 10th, he withdrew another $480 at the Humble Community Bank in Humble, Texas. Each transaction was captured on surveillance cameras. During the withdrawal in Arizona, investigators noticed something crucial in the background of the footage: a white Ford Focus. They determined Keyes was driving along Interstate 10 and pushed out a bulletin to law enforcement across the entire corridor. On March 11th, Keyes attended his sister's wedding in Wells, Texas. 2 days later, on the morning of March 13th, Texas Highway Patrol Corporal Brian Henry spotted a white Ford Focus matching the description in a hotel parking lot in Lufkin, Texas. He watched the vehicle, and when a man got in and drove away, Henry followed from a distance. When the Focus exceeded the speed limit by 3 miles per hour, Henry pulled it over. The driver produced an Alaska driver's license in the name of Israel Keyes. When Henry checked the license and saw Keyes was from Anchorage, he motioned to a backup officer. As more units arrived, Henry informed Keyes that they were investigating a kidnapping. When officers searched the vehicle, they found rolls of cash bound with rubber bands, some bills stained with bright ink from a bank robbery die pack, a piece of gray t-shirt cut to make a face mask matching the one seen in ATM footage, a highlighted map showing routes through California, Arizona, and New Mexico, and Samantha Koenig's identification card, ATM card, and cell phone. Keyes was arrested on the spot. 2 weeks later, Keyes was extradited to Alaska. He initially denied any involvement, then agreed to an interview without his lawyer present in exchange for a coffee, a candy bar, and a cigar. He confessed to kidnapping, raping, and murdering Koenig. When asked about the ATM card, Keyes appeared agitated that police had been able to trace it, apparently believing his disguises had been sufficient. Over the following months, FBI agents and Anchorage police conducted dozens of hours of interviews. Keyes admitted to killing the couriers in Vermont and hinted at 7 or 8 additional victims. He revealed how he buried kill kits, selected victims at random, and traveled extensively to avoid creating patterns. On April 2, 2012, the FBI's underwater search team recovered Samantha Koenig's dismembered body from Matanuska Lake. Keyes was indicted on April 18th and scheduled for trial in March of 2013. He faced possible death penalty. While in custody, he told investigators that he wanted to avoid publicity because of the negative attention his young daughter might face. On the night of December 1st, 2012, Keyes was last seen in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex, arranging items and getting into bed at 10:12 p.m. Sometime after that, he hid under his blankets, used a razor blade he had embedded into a pencil to slash his left wrist, and strangled himself with a strip of bedding. His body was discovered the next morning at 5:57 a.m. Underneath him were pages of crumpled, blood-soaked paper containing writing, but the note offered no clues about additional victims or the locations of their remains. Number 3. Dennis Nilsen. On the evening of February 8, 1983, a plumber named Michael Catran arrived at 23 Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London. Residents of the multi-tenant building had been complaining for days that their drains were blocked and toilets would not flush properly. Catran worked for Dino Rod, a London plumbing company, and this appeared to be a routine call. He opened a drain cover at the side of the house and began examining the blockage. What he found was not routine. The drain was packed with a pale, flesh-like substance and numerous small bones. Kaczynski had worked as a plumber for years. He knew what animal remains looked like. This was something else. He reported his findings to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. Because it was already getting dark, the two men agreed to return the following morning to investigate further. Before leaving the property, Kaczynski spoke briefly with some of the tenants, including a man from the top-floor flat named Dennis Nilsen. When Kaczynski mentioned that the blockage looked like human flesh, Nilsen responded with a joke. He said it looked to him like someone had been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. That night, after the plumber left, Dennis Nilsen went down to the drains. He knew exactly what was blocking them. He attempted to remove the human tissue manually, working in the darkness to clear away the evidence, but he was spotted by a tenant from one of the lower flats, who found his behavior suspicious. The following morning, at 7:30 a.m. on February 9th, Kaczynski and Wheeler returned to Cranley Gardens. They discovered that the drain had been mysteriously cleared overnight. This only heightened their suspicions. Kaczynski examined a pipe that led from the drain directly to the top-floor flat. Inside, he found scraps of flesh and 4 small bones. To both men, the bones looked as if they had come from a human hand. They immediately contacted the police. The remains were taken to the mortuary at Hornsey, where a pathologist examined them. He confirmed that the tissue and bones were human. One piece of flesh, which had come from a human neck, bore a clear ligature mark. The police learned from other tenants that the top-floor flat was occupied by a 37-year-old civil servant named Dennis Andrew Nilsen, who worked at a job center in Kentish Town. The detective chief inspector assembled a team and decided to wait outside 23 Cranley Gardens until Nilsen returned home from work that evening. Earlier that same day, Nilsen had told a colleague at the job center, in a joking manner, that if he was not at work the next day, he would either be ill, dead, or in jail. When Nilsen arrived home that evening and stepped into the dark hallway of his building, he found 3 men waiting for him. Detective Chief Inspector Jay informed Nilsen that they had come to speak with him about his drains. Nilsen asked if they were health inspectors. Jay told him they were police officers investigating the discovery of human remains in the building's drainage system. Jay asked if they could enter Nilsen's flat. Nilsen agreed. Upon entering the attic apartment, the officers were immediately struck by a pervasive smell of decomposition. Jay asked Nilsen directly what the odor was. He told Nilsen that human remains had been found blocking the drains and that they could only have come from his flat. Nilsen feigned shock and said, "Good grief, how awful." Detective Chief Inspector Jay then told Nilsen to stop playing games and to tell them where the rest of the body was. Nilsen's demeanor changed immediately. He responded calmly that the remainder of the body could be found in 2 plastic bags in a nearby wardrobe. The smell of decomposition from the wardrobe was overpowering. The officers did not open it. They asked Nilsen if there were any other body parts in the flat. Nilsen said there were. He told them it was a long story that went back a long time and that he wanted to tell them everything. He said he wanted to get it off his chest, but not there. He wanted to go to the police station. He was arrested and cautioned on suspicion of murder, then taken to Hornsey Police Station. At the station, a detective asked Nilsen how many bodies they were talking about. Nilsen replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. Over the following days, Nilsen provided a detailed, 30-hour taped confession. He described his crimes with disturbing calmness, naming some of his victims and explaining his methods. He led investigators to a second address, 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, where he had lived from 1975 to 1982. At that property, forensic teams found thousands of bone fragments buried in the garden. The remains confirmed that at least 8 additional victims had been killed and incinerated there. At 23 Cranley Gardens, officers found the dismembered bodies of 3 victims stored in various locations throughout the flat. On February 11, 1983, Nilsen was formally charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair, his final victim. Nilsen killed at least 11 more victims at Melrose Avenue. His targets were almost always vulnerable young men, homeless youth, runaways, or male prostitutes he met in bars and pubs. He lured them to his flat with offers of food, alcohol, and shelter. Once they were asleep or intoxicated, he would strangle them, usually with a ligature such as a necktie or electrical cord. If the victim was still breathing, he would drown them in his bathtub or kitchen sink. After each murder, Nilsen performed a ritual. He bathed the body, dressed it in clean clothing, and positioned it in a chair or on his bed. He would talk to the corpse as if it were still alive. When decomposition became too advanced, he would dissect the remains on his kitchen floor using a large knife. He buried limbs in the garden and stored torsos in suitcases until he could burn them. He built bonfires at the end of his garden and burned the bodies, sometimes keeping fires burning all day without raising suspicion from neighbors. After the flesh was consumed, he crushed the bones and scattered the fragments in the garden. It was in 1982 Nilsen made the decision that would ultimately lead to his capture. He moved to a new address, 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. The flat was on the top floor of a multi-tenant building. It had no garden. It had no accessible floorboards. Nilsen had lost the two disposal methods that had allowed him to kill with impunity for 4 years. But he did not stop killing. Between late 1982 and January of 1983, Nilsen murdered 3 more victims at Cranley Gardens. With no way to burn the bodies and no space to bury them, he was forced to improvise. He dismembered the remains on his kitchen floor, as he had done before. He boiled the heads, hands, and feet in a large cooking pot to remove the flesh from the bones. Then he attempted to flush the dissected tissue, internal organs, and smaller bones down the toilet. The final victim was a 20-year-old homeless man named Stephen Sinclair, who was also a heroin addict. Nilsen met him on Oxford Street in late January of 1983. He bought Sinclair a burger and invited him back to his flat. Sinclair was in a drug and alcohol-fueled stupor. Nilsen strangled him with a tie. He kept the body for 8 days before dismembering it. He stuffed the larger body parts into plastic bags and stored them in his wardrobe. He tried to flush the rest. But the volume of human tissue and bone that Nilsen had been disposing of since moving to Cranley Gardens was simply too much for a residential plumbing system to handle. On February 4th, 1983, Nilsen himself wrote a letter to the estate agents managing the property. He complained that the drains were blocked and that the situation was intolerable. He apparently did not connect his own disposal activities to the plumbing failure. At his trial, which began on October 24th, 1983, at the Old Bailey, Nilsen was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, arguing diminished responsibility due to mental defect. His defense team presented psychiatric testimony, claiming Nilsen suffered from personality disorders and was incapable of forming the intent to murder. 3 survivors testified about their ordeals. Physical evidence included photographs of the crime scenes, the chopping board Nilsen had used to dissect bodies, and the cooking pot he had used to boil skulls, hands, and feet. That pot is now on display at Scotland Yard's Crime Museum. On November 4th, 1983, after an 11-day trial, the jury returned a verdict. Nilsen was found guilty on 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. In December of 1994, Home Secretary Michael Howard replaced Nilsen's sentence with a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. Nilsen accepted this decision and did not appeal. Dennis Nilsen spent 34 years in prison. He was held in maximum security facilities, where he translated books into Braille, wrote extensively, and corresponded with journalists and members of the public. He showed little remorse for his crimes. On May 10, 2018, Nilsen was taken from his cell at HMP Full Sutton to York Hospital, complaining of severe stomach pain. Doctors discovered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. They repaired it surgically, but Nilsen suffered a blood clot as a complication. He died on May 12, 2018, at the age of 72. Number 4. Ted Kaczynski. Theodore Kaczynski lived alone in a 10-foot by 12-foot plywood cabin in the woods outside Lincoln, Montana, a remote area with no electricity, no running water, and no heat. He had built the structure himself in 1971 on a 1.4-acre plot of land he purchased for roughly $2,100. For 25 years, he spent his days reading books from the local library and writing in journals that would eventually fill more than 40,000 handwritten pages. But Kaczynski was not simply a recluse. Between 1978 and 1995, He conducted a bombing campaign that killed 3 people and injured 23 others, earning him the name Unabomber from the FBI case code Unabomb, which stood for University and Airline Bombing. Kaczynski's first bomb was delivered on May 25, 1978. A package addressed to Professor Buckley Christ at Northwestern University was found in a parking lot at the University of Illinois Chicago Circle campus. Because it had a Northwestern return address, it was forwarded to Christ, who did not recognize it and called campus security. When campus police officer Terry Marker opened the package, it exploded, causing minor injuries to his left hand. The bomb was crude compared to what would come later, but it marked the beginning of a 17-year campaign. Over the next year, Kaczynski sent a second bomb to Northwestern, injuring a graduate student, and then placed a bomb aboard American Airlines Flight 444, traveling from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The device malfunctioned but filled the cabin with smoke, forcing an emergency landing and causing 12 passengers to suffer smoke inhalation. This third attack prompted the formation of a federal task force in 1979 that included the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. They called it the Unabomb investigation. Kaczynski's bombs were meticulously constructed from common, untraceable materials like pipes, batteries, wires, wood, all carefully assembled to leave no forensic evidence. He sanded the wooden boxes to remove fingerprints. He used materials that could be obtained anywhere. The bombs were mailed through the U.S. Postal Service, or hand-delivered to locations where they would be picked up by unsuspecting victims. His targets appeared random at first, but investigators eventually identified a pattern. Kaczynski targeted universities, airlines, computer stores, and individuals associated with advancing technology. In June 1980, he sent a bomb to Percy Wood, the president of United Airlines, who was seriously injured when it exploded at his home in Lake Forest, Illinois. In May 1982, a bomb injured a secretary at Vanderbilt University. In July of the same year, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, was injured by another device. In May 1985, a graduate student at Berkeley named John Hauser, who was also a member of the U.S. Air Force, lost several fingers and the vision in one eye when a bomb exploded. The first fatality occurred on December 11, 1985. Hugh Scruton, a 38-year-old computer store owner in Sacramento, California, picked up what appeared to be a piece of scrap wood in the parking lot outside his shop. The bomb, hidden inside, detonated, killing him instantly. The device was filled with nails. After this attack, the bombing stopped for 6 years. Investigators had no explanation for the hiatus. When the attacks resumed in 1993, they were more devastating. In June of that year, 2 bombs mailed 2 days apart seriously injured geneticist Dr. Charles Epstein in Tiburon, California, and computer science professor Dr. David Gelernter at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Epstein lost 4 fingers and part of his hearing. Gelernter lost part of his hand and suffered damage to his sight and hearing. On December 10, 1994, advertising executive Thomas Mosser opened a package at his home in North Caldwell, New Jersey. His wife and 15-month-old daughter were nearby. The bomb, filled with nails and razor blades, exploded and killed him. In a letter to the New York Times, Kaczynski later explained that he targeted Mosser because his company, Burson Marsteller, had helped Exxon repair its public image after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. Kaczynski wrote that the company's objective was manipulating people's attitudes. The final attack came on April 24, 1995. Just 2 days after the Oklahoma City bombing, Gilbert Brent Murray, the 47-year-old president of the California Forestry Association, a timber industry lobbying group, was killed when he opened a package at his office in Sacramento. The package had been addressed to the previous president, who had retired. Murray was not the intended recipient. By this point, the FBI had spent over $50 million on the investigation and assembled a task force of more than 150 full-time investigators, analysts, and agents. Despite the resources, they had almost nothing. The bombs left no useful forensic evidence. Fingerprints recovered from some devices later proved not to match Kaczynski, leading some to believe he had planted them intentionally to mislead investigators. The only eyewitness account came from a woman who saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses near the scene of a 1987 bombing in Salt Lake City. A sketch was created based on her description, but it generated no viable leads. The case was at a complete standstill. Then, in June 1995, the FBI received a series of letters from someone who signed himself FC and used the plural pronoun we to suggest he was part of a group called the Freedom Club. The letters were sent to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Penthouse magazine. The author stated that he had written a 35,000-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future, and he demanded that it be published in full by a major newspaper. If his demand was met, he promised to desist from terrorism. If it was not, the bombings would continue. He added that if Penthouse published the document instead of the New York Times or the Washington Post, he would reserve the right to plant one more bomb intended to kill, because Penthouse was less respectable. The demand created a dilemma. Publishing the manifesto could be seen as giving in to terrorism, but refusing could result in more deaths. After lengthy discussions, Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh recommended publication, citing concern for public safety and the hope that someone might recognize the author. On September 19, 1995, the New York Times and the Washington Post jointly published the manifesto as a special supplement. The newspapers split the cost. The FBI immediately began receiving thousands of tips. Linda Patrick was a philosophy professor at Union College in Schenectady, New York. She was married to David Kaczynski, a social worker who ran a shelter for homeless and runaway youth in Albany. David had an older brother named Ted, who lived in a remote cabin in Montana. The brothers had been close in childhood, but they had become estranged as adults. Ted had sent David a series of angry letters in 1990 when David announced his engagement to Linda, criticizing her and calling the marriage a betrayal. Linda had never met Ted. In the summer of 1995, Linda had been in Paris when subway bombings occurred there. French newspapers covered the Unabomber case extensively, and the FBI had begun releasing more information to the public, including details about the suspect's woodworking ability, the cities he had lived in, and the fact that he was now considered to be a loner rather than part of a group. Linda found herself thinking about her brother-in-law. When the manifesto was published in September, she read it. The philosophical arguments about technology eroding human freedom, about the Industrial Revolution destroying the natural environment, sounded familiar. She recognized ideas Ted had expressed in letters he had sent to David over the years. She also recognized the way the arguments were structured, the tone of the writing, the phrasing. It took Linda 1 to 2 months to convince David to take her suspicions seriously. David initially hesitated. He told her that Ted had never been violent, that he could not imagine his brother doing what the Unabomber had done. But Linda persisted. She urged David to retrieve old letters Ted had written. David went through family papers and found letters dating back to the 1970s in which Ted had written to newspapers protesting the abuses of technology. The phrasing was strikingly similar to passages in the manifesto. One phrase in particular stood out: sphere of human freedom. It appeared in both a 1971 essay Ted had written and in the published manifesto. David and Linda spent evenings for 2 to 3 hours discussing the possibility. They compared Ted's letters to the manifesto. Linda was convinced, and David became convinced. But the realization brought enormous fear. They discussed the possibility that Ted could be mentally ill, that he might need help rather than punishment. They also feared the death penalty. Before contacting authorities, they hired a private investigator in Chicago named Susan Swanson to discreetly investigate Ted's activities. They also consulted a former FBI behavioral science expert and hired a criminal defense lawyer through a Washington attorney named Anthony Bissigli. Through Bissigli, they sought assurances from the FBI that David's identity would be kept confidential and that Ted would receive appropriate psychiatric evaluation rather than immediate execution. In January 1996, David Kaczynski contacted the FBI through his attorney. He provided letters and documents written by Ted. The FBI conducted a linguistic analysis comparing the letters to the manifesto. The analysis determined that the author of the letters and the author of the manifesto were almost certainly the same person. The analysis was combined with biographical facts about Ted Kaczynski. He had grown up in the Chicago area, where the first bombings occurred. He had taught at the University of California, Berkeley, where 2 bombs had been placed, and he had lived in Salt Lake City, another target city. The FBI obtained a search warrant from a federal judge in Montana. On April 3, 1996, a 9-man FBI SWAT team, along with U.S. Marshals and other federal agents, surrounded the cabin near Lincoln, Montana. 2 FBI agents and a Forest Service agent approached the cabin using a ruse. They told Kaczynski they were conducting a property survey and might need to cut down a tree on his land. Kaczynski emerged from the cabin and began to go back inside. The agents grabbed him and pulled him out. He was arrested without incident around noon. Inside the cabin, investigators found a completed bomb ready to be mailed. They found a wealth of bomb-making components, chemicals, wires, pipes, batteries, tools. They found more than 40,000 handwritten journal pages documenting bomb-making experiments, descriptions of Unabomber crimes, daily life, and philosophical beliefs. They also found the original typed manuscript of Industrial Society and Its Future, and the typewriter on which it had been written. Every item linked Kaczynski definitively to the Unabomber attacks. Despite David's request for confidentiality, his role as the informant was leaked to CBS News reporter Dan Rather. Kaczynski was transferred to Sacramento, California, where he was arraigned on a 10-count federal indictment. The charges covered 4 bombing incidents that resulted in 2 deaths, Hugh Scruton and Gilbert Murray, and 2 serious injuries to Dr. Charles Epstein and Dr. David Gelernter. He was also charged in New Jersey for the murder of Thomas Mosser. In early January 1998, Kaczynski attempted suicide in his jail cell by trying to hang himself with a piece of underwear. He then requested to represent himself, but a court-appointed psychiatrist diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. On January 7, 1998, Judge Garland Burrell ruled that Kaczynski's attorneys could present mental health evidence over his objection and that Kaczynski could not represent himself due to his mental state. On January 22, 1998, Theodore Kaczynski pleaded guilty to all federal charges in both California and New Jersey. He accepted responsibility for all 16 Unabomber attacks between 1978 and 1995. In exchange, the Department of Justice agreed not to seek the death penalty. The plea agreement stipulated a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kaczynski waived his right to appeal. On May 4, 1998, Judge Burrell sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences plus 30 years. He was also ordered to pay $15,026,000 in restitution to his victims. In August 1998, David Kaczynski received a $1 million reward from the FBI, one of the largest rewards ever paid in a domestic terrorism case. He and Linda established the Unabomb Survivors Fund and distributed $630,000 to the victims and their families after taxes and legal fees. Theodore Kaczynski was sent to the federal supermax prison ADX Florence in Colorado, where he was held in a section once known as Bombers Row because it housed multiple domestic terrorists who had used explosives. In December 2021, he was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, due to poor health and late-stage cancer. On June 10, 2023, he was found unresponsive in his cell around 12:30 in the morning. Emergency responders performed CPR and transported him to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead. 4 sources confirmed to the Associated Press that the death was a suicide. He was 81 years old. Number 5. Stephen McDaniel. Stephen McDaniel stood outside the Barrington Place apartment complex in Macon, Georgia, on the afternoon of June 30, 2011, speaking to a reporter from WGXA news station about his missing neighbor. He was 25 years old, a recent graduate of Mercer University School of Law, and he described Lauren Giddings as nice as can be and very personable. He suggested that perhaps she had been snatched while out running, that when he and a friend went into her apartment with a key, nothing appeared out of place. He seemed calm, composed, eager to help. But moments later, the reporter informed him that police had discovered a body. McDaniel's face changed immediately. He repeated the word body, as if hearing it for the first time. He asked to sit down. His composure dissolved into visible panic, tears forming in his eyes as he said he didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her. The interview ended abruptly. What McDaniel didn't know was that at the exact moment he was speaking to the camera, Investigators had found Lauren Giddings' dismembered torso in a trash can just outside the apartment complex, where both of them lived. Lauren Giddings was 27 years old and had graduated from Mercer Law School that same spring. She was studying for the Georgia bar exam with plans to become a public defender. She had told her family and friends in mid-June that she would be largely unavailable for the next few weeks, focused entirely on her studies. By June 27th, no one had heard from her. At first, her sister Caitlin and other friends assumed she was simply immersed in preparation. But by June 29th, the silence felt wrong. Text messages went unanswered. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. On the evening of June 29th, Caitlin contacted the Macon Police Department, and their father drove from Maryland to file a missing person report. Police arrived at the apartment complex on June 30th and began searching the area. Detectives noticed a strong odor of decomposition. They followed it to a green trash can outside the building and found Lauren's torso wrapped in plastic. The body was not immediately identified, but DNA testing would later confirm it was her. What investigators didn't know yet was that Stephen McDaniel had murdered Lauren 4 days earlier. At approximately 4:30 in the morning on June 26th, he had used a stolen master key to enter her apartment while she slept. He was wearing a mask and gloves. He stood in her bedroom doorway watching her. When a floorboard creaked, she woke up. She sat up in bed, saw him, and according to his later confession, she pulled off his mask and said, "Stephen, please stop." She told him to get out. McDaniel leaped across the bed and grabbed her throat. They tumbled to the floor. He strangled her to death with his hands. He dragged her body to the bathtub and returned to his own apartment next door. His internet activity that morning showed that by 5:42, he was searching for information about blades. Shortly after, he began watching the movie The Hangover Part 2. The following night, around midnight on June 27th, he returned to her apartment with a hacksaw. He dismembered her body in the bathroom, sawing off her head, arms, and legs. He disposed of her torso in the trash can outside the complex just before daylight on June 28th. Her other remains were placed in dumpsters around Macon. Her head, arms, and legs were never recovered. McDaniel had been obsessed with Lauren Giddings for months. They had lived next door to each other at the apartment complex since fall 2008, both students at Mercer Law. He had asked her out multiple times. She declined each time but remained polite. She told friends he made her feel uneasy. What she didn't fully realize was the extent of his surveillance. McDaniel had stolen a master key from the apartment building manager. He had a duplicate key cut specifically for her apartment. He broke into her unit multiple times when she wasn't home, moving items around. In June, she sent an email to her boyfriend, stating that she believed someone had tried to break into her apartment. McDaniel had also constructed a crude surveillance device by duct taping a video camera to a 6-foot wooden pole, which he used to peer into her windows. Memory cards recovered from his apartment later contained deleted videos showing him filming her from outside on the night he murdered her. His computer revealed an escalating pattern of searches throughout May and June 2011, her social media profiles, her LinkedIn account, her Amazon wish list. These searches often coincided with his viewing of violent pornography. Under the screen name SOL, which stood for Son of Liberty, he had written hundreds of posts on internet message boards describing torture and violence toward women, methods of hiding evidence, and techniques for dismemberment. After these posts, he would often write, "This is all hypothetical, of course." When police began canvassing the apartment complex on June 30th, they spoke with every resident. All of them agreed to allow searches of their apartments except McDaniel. He initially refused, explaining, "It's the lawyer in me. I'm just always protective of my space." He eventually allowed one detective to walk through his unit, but only if he was present the entire time. During that walkthrough, McDaniel made a critical error. He admitted to police that he had burglarized 2 neighbors' apartments and stolen condoms from each. This confession gave investigators legal grounds to arrest him on burglary charges. It was this holding charge that allowed them to detain him and build their murder case. Later that same day, after his on-camera panic had been broadcast across the community, McDaniel was brought to the Macon Police Department for interrogation. What followed was one of the most unusual interrogations in modern criminal investigation. For more than 12 hours, from the night of June 30th into the early hours of July 1st, McDaniel sat nearly motionless in the interrogation room. Even when detectives left him alone, he remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead. He answered most questions with the phrase, "I don't know." Detective David Patterson and Detective Scott Chapman questioned him for hours about Lauren's whereabouts, but he offered nothing. His extreme physical stillness suggested either highly controlled self-discipline or a dissociative psychological response. He showed no emotion regarding Lauren's death. The evidence against him quickly began to pile up. A more thorough search of his apartment revealed packaging for a hacksaw that matched the brand and type of a bloody hacksaw found in the apartment complex's laundry room. Testing confirmed the blood was Lauren's. Investigators also found a bloody sheet in the laundry room. Inside McDaniel's apartment, they discovered a pair of Lauren's underwear in his dresser, later confirmed through DNA testing. They found the master key to the building. They found swords, guns, and a mask made from women's underwear. But the most damning evidence came from his computer. Forensic analysts recovered the surveillance videos showing him filming Lauren from outside her window on the night of June 26th, proving the murder was premeditated. His internet search history revealed searches for terms like choked unconscious, how long wake up, dismemberment, cremation, and escaped prison. Hours after killing Lauren, he searched the Bibb County garbage collection website. McDaniel was formally charged with murder on August 2nd, 2011. He initially pleaded not guilty. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they planned to introduce his extensive online posts describing violence toward women and his detailed internet activity timeline. They intended to seek the death penalty. McDaniel's defense attorneys, Floyd Buford Jr. and Franklin Hogue, believed an insanity defense was his only chance to avoid execution. But McDaniel resisted this strategy. McDaniel spent months in isolation at the Bibb County Jail, and by the time of his court appearances, witnesses described him as pale, blank-faced, hunched over, almost staggering into the courtroom. 1 week before his trial was scheduled to begin in April 2014, McDaniel's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. The agreement was contentious. McDaniel initially demanded that Lauren's family drop their wrongful death lawsuit against him as a condition of his plea. Lauren's close friend and family spokeswoman, Kristen Miller, said the family would only agree if his confession was fulsome, truthful, and verifiable. There were doubts. Miller stated that the confession appeared to be written backwards to fit the known evidence. On the day of the scheduled plea hearing, McDaniel still hadn't agreed to the family's counteroffer. A last-minute compromise was reached in which McDaniel accepted a consent judgment, finding him liable for Lauren's death, with the family entitled to a hearing for monetary damages if he was ever granted parole. Lauren's sister, Caitlin Wheeler, later said McDaniel took advantage of us in our most vulnerable state during these negotiations. On April 21, 2014, Stephen McDaniel pleaded guilty to malice murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. As part of the plea agreement, McDaniel filed a written confession describing his account of the murder. He stated that at 4:30 in the morning on June 26th, wearing a mask and gloves, he entered Lauren's apartment using the master key. He watched her sleep. When she awoke and told him to leave, he jumped on her and strangled her. He placed her body in the bathtub. The next night, he returned with the hacksaw and dismembered her. He wrote that he put her torso in the trash can just before daylight on June 28th. At his sentencing, McDaniel offered a brief, unemotional apology to Lauren's family. District Attorney David Cook stated that he fully expected McDaniel to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Under the terms of his sentence, McDaniel will be eligible for parole in 2041 after serving 30 years. He is currently incarcerated at Hancock State Prison in Hancock County, Georgia. These killers thought they'd get away with murder. They believed they'd outsmarted the law, that their planning was flawless, that they were too careful to ever be caught. They were wrong. Dennis Rader trusted a floppy disk. Israel Keyes used a victim's ATM card. Dennis Nilsen tried flushing bodies down a shared drain. Ted Kaczynski published his manifesto. Stephen McDaniel talked to the news on camera. One dumb move was all it took. If you found these investigations valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into cases like this.